By the spring of 1815, most of Europe believed the Napoleon problem had finally been solved. After years of war, shifting alliances, and endless campaigns that had reshaped the continent, the former emperor had been removed from power and placed on a small Mediterranean island where, according to the plans of Europe's leaders, he would spend the rest of his life quietly managing local affairs and staying far away from politics. It sounded reasonable. In fact, it sounded almost perfect. The man who had commanded vast armies and ruled over millions was now governing a tiny island with a population smaller than many neighborhoods in Paris. On paper, the story was finished. The conqueror had become a caretaker. The emperor had become a local administrator. Europe could finally relax. But there was one small problem. Napoleon Bonaparte had never been the kind of man who accepted limits simply because someone else had drawn them. While kings and diplomats celebrated their success, Napoleon spent his days studying reports, speaking with loyal followers, and watching events unfold across the water. The island may have been small, but information traveled surprisingly well. Visitors arrived, news circulated, letters found their way into trusted hands. And the more Napoleon learned about France, the more convinced he became that his exile was not the ending everyone imagined. The restored monarchy was struggling to win hearts. Veterans who had fought under Napoleon felt forgotten. Officers who had built their careers during the empire found themselves pushed aside. Ordinary citizens were growing frustrated with promises that seemed disconnected from reality. Every new report added another piece to the puzzle. France was not at peace with its new rulers. France was restless, and restless nations are dangerous because they are often searching for someone to believe in. As the months passed, Napoleon began viewing his exile differently. At first, it had seemed like a punishment. Then it felt like a waiting period. Now, it looked increasingly like an opportunity. The island could not contain his ambitions any more than a fence could contain a storm. He studied maps. He calculated routes. He considered risks. Most importantly, he considered timing. Across Europe, the great powers were gathered at the Congress of Vienna, arguing over borders and influence. They were busy reorganizing the continent, dividing territories, and debating the future. Their attention was focused everywhere, except on the small island where Napoleon was quietly planning the most audacious comeback in modern history. He understood something that many of his enemies had forgotten. Victory often belongs not to the strongest side, but to the side that recognizes the right moment. And from his perspective, that moment had arrived. In late February, preparations accelerated. Loyal soldiers were gathered. Ships were made ready. Trusted officers were informed. There were no grand announcements and no dramatic declarations. Everything moved with calm efficiency. Napoleon knew that speed was essential. If word spread too early, the plan would collapse before it even began. So the operation remained small, controlled, and remarkably simple. One evening, he was still an exiled ruler on a distant island. A short time later, he was sailing toward France. The escape itself seemed almost impossible. British naval patrols controlled much of the Mediterranean. European governments had spent years fighting him. Entire coalitions had formed simply to prevent his return. Yet somehow, the former emperor slipped through the cracks. His small flotilla crossed the sea without interception. Ships passed in the distance. Patrols failed to react in time. Confusion and disbelief worked in his favor. After all, who would seriously expect a recently exiled emperor to attempt such an outrageous gamble? The idea sounded too absurd to be real, and that absurdity became his greatest weapon. While officials struggled to accept what is happening, Napoleon continued moving forward. Day after day, the coast of France grew closer. Every mile increased the stakes. There would be no second chance. If he failed, exile would be replaced by something far worse. Yet the risk seemed worth taking because Napoleon understood that history rarely rewards caution. Eventually, the coastline appeared on the horizon. The ships approached the shore near the Gulf of Juan. On March 1st, 1815, Napoleon stepped onto French soil with roughly 1,000 loyal followers. Compared to the armies he had once commanded, the force was tiny. It was barely large enough to be considered an invasion. Yet appearances can be deceptive. Napoleon was not relying on military strength. He was relying on psychology. He was betting that loyalty still existed within the hearts of French soldiers. He was betting that memories of past victories remained stronger than allegiance to the restored monarchy. Most importantly, he was betting that people wanted him back. It was a gamble unlike any he had taken before because success depended entirely on how others would react. If French troops obeyed their orders, his return would end almost immediately. If they hesitated, everything could change. Rather than march along heavily defended coastal routes, Napoleon turned inland through the mountains. The decision was brilliant. The terrain was difficult, but it reduced the likelihood of encountering large royalist forces too early. More importantly, it gave him time. Villages heard rumors before they saw him. Towns received news of his arrival hours before he appeared. Everywhere he went, stories spread. Napoleon had escaped. Napoleon was marching north. Napoleon was returning. At first, many people refused to believe it. Then disbelief turned into curiosity. Curiosity became excitement. Excitement became momentum. As his column advanced, crowds gathered to watch. Some came out of fascination. Others came out of admiration. Many simply wanted to witness history. The farther he traveled, the larger the crowds became. Yet the greatest challenge still lay ahead. Royal troops had been dispatched to stop him. Orders were clear. Napoleon was to be arrested immediately. The government understood the danger. Every hour he remained free increased the chances of rebellion. Every mile he advanced increased his influence. The confrontation everyone expected finally arrived near Laffrey. A battalion of royal soldiers stood directly in his path. The situation could not have been more dangerous. Napoleon's force was outnumbered. The soldiers facing him were armed and organized. They had explicit instructions to stop the former emperor before he reached the interior of France. For a few moments, the future of Europe hung in the balance. One volley of musket fire could end everything. Napoleon understood this. His officers understood it. The soldiers on both sides understood it. Yet what happened next would become one of the most extraordinary moments in political history. Instead of preparing for battle, Napoleon walked forward alone. He moved ahead of his men and approached the royal troops without fear. There were no defensive formations, no hidden reserves, no elaborate strategy. Just one man advancing toward an army that had every legal right to shoot him. The tension was unbearable. Every eye remained fixed on the approaching figure. Then Napoleon spoke. He reminded the soldiers who he was. He reminded them of the campaigns they had fought together. He reminded them of victories, sacrifices, and shared memories. Finally, according to many accounts, he opened his coat and declared that if any soldier wished to kill his emperor, he was standing there ready. The effect was immediate. The soldiers hesitated. Then they lowered their weapons. Moments later, cheers erupted. Men who had been sent to arrest Napoleon rushed forward to greet him. The battalion joined his cause. What should have been the end of his adventure became the beginning of something far larger. News of the encounter spread across France like wildfire. Suddenly, the impossible no longer seemed impossible. If one group of soldiers had refused to fight him, others might do the same. If one battalion could switch sides, perhaps entire armies could follow. And as Napoleon continued marching north, that is exactly what began to happen. Units sent to stop him joined him instead. Officers abandoned the king's cause. Supporters emerged from every direction. The government watched in growing alarm as the man they believed defeated gathered strength with every step. Napoleon was not conquering France. France was opening its doors to him. Every village, every road, every new group of supporters increased the sense of inevitability surrounding his return. By the time he approached Paris, the political situation had transformed completely. The king's confidence evaporated. Ministers panicked. Loyalists realized that resistance might be impossible. The momentum had become overwhelming. What began as a desperate gamble by an exiled ruler had turned into a national movement. Europe stared in disbelief. The man they had removed from power less than a year earlier was returning without fighting major battles, without launching a massive invasion, and without firing significant shots. He was reclaiming an empire through reputation alone. The comeback seemed impossible because by every traditional measure, it should have been impossible. Yet history has a habit of rewarding individuals who understand something fundamental about power. Armies matter. Laws matter. Governments matter. But belief matters too. And in the spring of 1815, millions of people still believed in Napoleon Bonaparte. That belief carried him from a tiny island in the Mediterranean all the way back to the throne of France. For a brief moment, it appeared that the impossible had happened. The emperor had returned. The exile was over. And Europe was about to discover that removing Napoleon from power had been far easier than keeping him there. At first, the closer you move toward Paris, the more unbelievable the entire situation becomes. Just a few weeks ago, you were a former emperor living on a small Mediterranean island, officially defeated, officially exiled, and supposedly finished. Now every mile you march through France seems to pull more people to your side. Soldiers who were ordered to arrest you are joining you instead. Officers who once served under your command are returning. Towns that should be hostile are greeting you with curiosity, excitement, or cautious support. And with every passing day, the government in Paris grows more nervous. Because this is no longer a military problem. It is becoming a crisis of legitimacy. A government can survive many things, but it struggles to survive when people stop believing in it. That is exactly what is beginning to happen. News travels across France faster than your army. Reports arrive in government offices describing entire units switching sides without firing a shot. Officials who once felt secure now begin asking uncomfortable questions. What happens if Napoleon reaches Paris? What happens if the army refuses to stop him? What happens if the people welcome him back? These questions spread uncertainty through the royal government. And uncertainty is dangerous because it weakens confidence long before it weakens power. As you continue north, your small force transforms into something much larger than its numbers suggest. Technically, you still do not have a massive army, but what you possess is momentum, and momentum is often more powerful than raw strength. Every successful encounter makes the next one easier. Every regiment that joins you increases the pressure on the next regiment to do the same. Soldiers begin hearing stories before they ever see you. They hear that others lowered their weapons. They hear that former comrades have already joined your march. They hear that resistance is collapsing. And when people expect something to happen, they often help make it happen. That is exactly what begins unfolding across France. What started as a risky gamble now feels increasingly like an unstoppable movement. Even people who are not particularly loyal to you begin reconsidering their position. Politics has always attracted those who prefer to stand on the winning side. As your success grows, more and more influential figures quietly start preparing for the possibility that you might actually reclaim power. Meanwhile, Paris becomes a city filled with rumors. Every day brings new reports, new speculation, and new anxiety. Some stories exaggerate your strength. Others underestimate it. No one seems to know exactly what is happening, but everyone agrees that something extraordinary is taking place. Government ministers hold urgent meetings. Advisors debate possible responses. Some argue for military action. Others suggest negotiation. A few simply hope the situation somehow resolves itself. Unfortunately for them, history rarely rewards wishful thinking. The deeper problem is that every option now carries risk. Sending more troops might only create more defections. Waiting might allow your support to grow even further. Negotiating could make the government appear weak. The royal administration finds itself trapped by uncertainty, and uncertainty is exactly where you thrive. Throughout your career, you have repeatedly turned confusion into opportunity. Now you are doing it again, not with massive armies and grand battles, but with psychology, timing, and reputation. As the days pass, your journey begins to feel less like a military campaign and more like a legend unfolding in real time. Villagers gather along roads just to catch a glimpse of you. Veterans recall stories from earlier campaigns. Young people who never served under you still know your name. Everywhere you go, conversations revolve around one question. Can this really be happening? Can a man who lost everything truly come back and reclaim it? Rationally, many people know how unlikely it sounds, yet every day provides more evidence that the impossible is becoming reality. And perhaps that is what makes the story so powerful. Human beings are naturally drawn to comebacks. They are fascinated by people who refuse to accept defeat. Whether they support you or oppose you, they cannot ignore what is happening. The entire country becomes captivated by your return. Eventually, the pressure becomes too much for the royal government to ignore. Confidence begins collapsing from within. Some officials remain loyal, but others start calculating their future. If Napoleon returns to power, where do they stand? If the king remains in control, where do they stand? Self-preservation becomes a powerful force. Throughout history, political systems often appear stable until suddenly they are not. Once enough people begin doubting the future, stability can vanish with surprising speed. That is precisely what starts happening. The government still exists. Orders are still being issued. Authority still technically belongs to the king. Yet beneath the surface, faith in that authority is weakening. And once faith begins to disappear, events can accelerate very quickly. Finally, the moment approaches that once seemed impossible. Paris lies ahead, the capital, the heart of France, the center of political power. Everything has led to this point. The risks, the planning, the escape from Elba, the march through the mountains, the encounters with soldiers, the growing support. Every step has brought you closer to this destination. But even now, nothing is guaranteed. Success often appears inevitable only after it happens. In reality, every stage has depended on countless decisions, reactions, and moments of hesitation from other people. Yet one thing is undeniable. The exile that was supposed to end your story has instead created one of the most remarkable comebacks in history. Europe believed it had solved the Napoleon problem. Instead, it is about to discover that the problem has returned, and this time, it is walking directly toward Paris. By the time you approach Paris, the atmosphere across France feels completely different from the one that existed when you left Elba. What began as a daring escape has transformed into a political earthquake. Everywhere, people are talking about the same thing. Not taxes, not local disputes, not ordinary concerns, but your return. Newspapers struggle to keep up with events. Government officials receive conflicting reports. One message says you are leading a small band of loyal followers. The next claims you are marching at the head of an unstoppable force. The truth lies somewhere in between. But perception often matters more than reality. And right now, perception is working entirely in your favor. The more people hear about your advance, the larger and more powerful you seem. Every town you pass through adds another layer to the legend. Every regiment that joins you makes resistance appear more hopeless. Before long, many people stop asking whether you can reach Paris and start asking what will happen when you do. Inside the royal court, panic begins replacing confidence. Only weeks earlier, officials had dismissed the possibility of your return as ridiculous. Now those same officials are scrambling to respond to a situation they never truly prepared for. Meetings stretch late into the night. Advisors argue. Military commanders review options. Some urge immediate action while there is still time. Others warn that aggressive measures could make things worse. The king himself faces an impossible dilemma. Every decision carries enormous risk. If he stays and fights, he risks being captured or overthrown. If he flees, he risks looking weak and surrendering authority without a struggle. Neither choice is appealing. Yet history has a way of forcing leaders into situations where no option feels safe. As reports continue arriving from across the country, the reality becomes harder to ignore. The army cannot be fully trusted to stop you. Too many soldiers still respect your name. Too many officers remember serving under your command. And too many people are beginning to believe that your return is inevitable. The most remarkable part of the entire journey is how little actual fighting has taken place. Historians often focus on battles, but this campaign is being won largely without them. Instead of defeating enemies on battlefields, you are defeating assumptions. Europe assumed you were finished. France assumed exile had ended your influence. The monarchy assumed the army would remain loyal. One by one, those assumptions collapse. And every time another assumption falls apart, your position grows stronger. This is why your march feels so unusual. It is less about military conquest and more about psychological momentum. People are responding not just to the man standing before them, but to the idea he represents. To many veterans, you symbolize glory and achievement. To others, you represent stability in uncertain times. Even those who dislike you cannot deny your ability to inspire loyalty. And that loyalty is proving more valuable than any weapon. As you move closer to the capital, support continues growing, and former officials begin returning. Experienced officers offer their services. Political figures quietly change sides. Some are motivated by genuine admiration. Others are motivated by survival. Throughout history, people have often been quick to support whoever appears destined to win. Right now, that person is increasingly looking like you. The royal government can feel the ground shifting beneath its feet. Every defection creates another. Every public show of support encourages others to step forward. Momentum becomes self-sustaining. Even those who remain loyal to the king